Today we're reading Chapter 55, A New Kind of Power. Martin Luther King Jr. was carried to his grave in a casket of polished African mahogany on a plain farm cart pulled by two mules. The cart and the mules reminded people that King's ancestors had farmed America's land with courage and dignity. The mahogany symbolized his African heritage. Weeping at the graveside were leaders from around the world who had come to pay tribute to the man who had earned a Nobel Peace Prize with his message of love, brotherhood, and peace. But at the very same time King was being lowered into the ground, 130 cities around the nation were burning. Rioters looting and shooting were killing people and destroying homes and businesses. 65,000 troops had to be called in to put down the riots. Almost all the victims were black. When the fires cooled, 39 people were dead. The rioters said they were responding to the murder of Martin Luther King Jr. But was that the right thing to do in memory of a man who had dedicated his life to nonviolence? Hadn't they heard his message? Most black people had. Every poll showed that the majority of African Americans approved of the ideas of Martin Luther King Jr. and disapproved of violence. But a black minority, a strong, active minority, was listening to other voices. Mostly those voices were young, male, urban, and angry. They were black power leaders. They wanted to change their world, and it certainly needed changing. Some of them seemed to want power so they could get even for the terrible oppression of slavery and segregation. Some, disgusted by all oppression, wanted to separate themselves from whites. But some others wanted to bring respect and power to a black community that would then act on equal terms with whites. In this picture, Martin Luther King Jr.'s final journey to Atlanta in a mule-drawn farm cart was broadcast by satellite to millions all over the world. Over here, this picture, in the days following Dr. King's assassination, cities across the country erupted in riots. Decades later, black neighborhoods in many cities had still not recovered economically. Over here, a year of headlines, 1968. January 31, North Vietnam launches the Tet Offense. March 31st, President Lyndon Johnson announces that he will not seek re-election. April 4th, Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. Riots erupt in cities across the country. June 4th and 5th, Robert Kennedy wins the California Democratic presidential primary and addresses supporters in Los Angeles. Minutes later, he is shot and dies the next day. September, members of NOW and other women's rights groups protest the Miss America pageant in Atlantic City, New Jersey. October 18th, U.S. athletes and medalists at the Olympic Games in Mexico City raised their fists in a Black Power salute during the playing of the Star-Spangled Banner. November 5th, Richard Nixon wins the presidency. College campuses nationwide observe Turn in Your Draft Card Day. December 21st, Apollo 8 begins the first U.S. mission to orbit the moon. That first idea didn't go far. Most black people had no intention of being oppressors. A few did want to separate themselves from the rest of America's citizens, which, after the sacrifices of the civil rights time, was difficult for many to understand. But that idea of power through respect, now that was appealing. Soon blacks and whites, too, were studying African American history. They were also learning about Africa and its history. They were wearing African-inspired clothes. They were telling stories of slavery from the slave's point of view. They were taking pride in an inheritance full of stories of achievement. They were voting and electing blacks as sheriffs and mayors and congresspeople. Black writers were bringing new sensitivities to readers. They were not just writing for African Americans, they were writing for all people. In 1940, Richard Wright published Native Son. 5 years later, his Black Boy was a main selection of the Book of the Month Club. Ralph Ellison, whose ancestry was black, white, and Native American, wrote Invisible Man, 1952, a novel about the ways in which society can ignore the ordinary person and make him feel invisible and powerless. In a stunning first novel titled Go Tell It on the Mountain, 1953, James Baldwin wrote about the religious awakening of a boy living in Harlem. Black women were among the best writers of the time. Zora Neale Hurston, who was part of the pre-World War II artistic movement known as the Harlem Renaissance, was rediscovered and celebrated. Hurston's great novel, Their Eyes Were Watching God, which is both funny and profound, inspired many other writers. Toni Morrison was one of them. She won the Nobel Prize for Literature. There is no higher honor. Alice Walker, Maya Angelou, and Paula Marshall, too, found power in words and ideas. Before he was killed, Malcolm X found power as a speechmaker. Malcolm had quit school, become a thief and drug peddler, and landed in jail. He was frustrated. He wanted to turn his life around, but he couldn't express himself because he didn't have control of the English language. He decided to do something about that. He got a dictionary from the prison school and carefully copied every word onto a tablet. With every succeeding page, he recalled, I also learned of people and places and events from history. As his vocabulary grew, so did his sense of power and confidence. In 1960, blacks had very little political power. In that year, there were only a few more than 100 black elected officials in the whole United States. By 1993, there were more than 8,000, including 40 members of Congress. Thurgood Marshall and Clarence Thomas had been appointed justices to the Supreme Court. Between 1950 and 1990, the number of African Americans in white-collar jobs, which means those who took work in offices, leapt from 10% to 40% of all black workers. Black men and women were engineers, doctors, lawyers, politicians, ball players, government workers, and artists. Many lived in beautiful houses and belonged to fancy clubs. As to entertainment and sports, Bill Cosby and Irvin Magic Johnson were hard to top until Oprah Winfrey, Michael Jordan, and Tiger Woods came along. This photo shows Richard Wright, author of Native Son and Black Boy. This photo over here shows Maya Angelou, poet and author of I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. Down here is a picture of Michael Jordan became a popular superstar as he brought unprecedented attention to the game of basketball. Although most people still seem to think in racial terms, that concern was hiding the real problem, poverty in this prosperous land. Martin Luther King Jr. had seen that. Bobby Kennedy understood that America would never truly be a land of the free if some people were trapped in poverty and inequality. Today in America, he said, we are two worlds. They were the worlds of rich and poor. He said he hoped to build a bridge between those worlds. Kennedy decided he would run for president. There were many who believed he would win, and so he set out, giving speeches across the country. Young people flocked to his side wherever he went. However, along with the cheers were also hate pamphlets. In California, 2 months after Dr. King's funeral, Kennedy won the Democratic primaries in California and South Dakota. On June 5, 1968, in front of a cheering crowd, he thanked some of those who had helped him, his staff, his friends, his wife, and Cesar Chavez. Then Robert Kennedy, heading for a press conference, took a shortcut through the hotel kitchen. A shot rang out, and the man who might have been president was no more. It was the end of an era. This photo up here, thousands of people lined the railroad tracks as a train carried the slain Robert F. Kennedy from his funeral in New York to his burial in Arlington National Cemetery near Washington, D.C. Down here, each time a man stands up for an ideal or acts to improve the lot of others or strikes out against injustice, he sends a tiny ripple of hope, and crossing each other from a million different centers of energy and daring, these ripples will build a current which can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance. Robert Kennedy speaking in South Africa.